now. All right. Okay. So Elaine is going to share her screen.
Excellent.
So start with that. She's going to look. We're going to look at some of her recent field map-based processing output.
Can you see it, Alfonso?
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
So I've done the preprocessing. So I've done volume-based preprocessing with and without field maps, and I've done surface-based with field maps. So I'm going to start with the surface-based preprocessing where I use the field maps. And when I was looking at the QA plots, I just had some questions about what we're looking at. And I guess coming back to that question again, how do we judge, what's good data, what's bad data? And how well is the processing working? So this is the realignment images. So here I was just wondering, what exactly we're looking at. So the brain, I guess, just looks a little bit different to how it comes out from the volume base. So is this
right? This is so yes. This is just looking at the realignment, and it's showing you the first and the last scan image of each run. So you probably have 4 runs in this, and it's just showing you the first and last. And the whole idea of this is just making sure, like visually, that they all look pretty much identical. If the realignment works correctly, then all of the gross subject movement should be corrected. So after this correction, the one particular slice should be identical or pretty much identical to independent of whether it was at what time point was acquired or during which run it was acquired. And that's kind of like what you see here. I don't see any obvious or even noticeable differences between those 8 images. So that looks fine, basically. It's typically very rare that this realignment wouldn't work, but it's just something to very easy to check, because you just look that they look pretty much identical, and if they do, then you're fine. And if you have one run that for some reason didn't kind of register correctly, it will probably fail very dramatically, and you will notice very easily. And that could happen, for example, if the first image in a run is very bad for some particular reason, and then the realignment of that run might show some particular issues, and you will notice in here. But in this, everything looks fine.
One of the things that the look here is different, Alfonso, and I just wanted to confirm this. I was talking with Elaine the other day. I had this theory that in this pipeline that we're using here, this is the surface pipeline, we don't actually normalize the subject to MNI or any other template space at the start. So before, when you looked, you saw this somewhat uniform looking axial slice. Here, it looks different in that. I'm guessing that's because we're not rotating the scan into a particular orientation, and so you can have these oblique cuts through when we select the first one.
Yeah, that's a good point. When we have MNI normalized data, then we are always looking at pretty much at the same slice for all of these plots across subjects. But in this pipeline, we don't do any co-registration across subjects. Everything that is co-registered is actually the functional data to the structural data. So we maintain everything at the same orientation of the structural data, just to keep everything in the same orientation that the free surfaces have been generated on. And that, and Jason is exactly right. That means that in this is just showing one particular slice, middle slice of the entire acquisition, and that could be really oblique or kind of strange looking. So this kind of quality assurance plot is not so much to identify what exactly you are looking at, but just identify if there are any difference at all across time. And no matter what you're looking at, if it's relatively representative, it shouldn't show any type of residual motion effects, and it should look identical, even though, in this case, it might be slightly inconvenient to have something that is slightly oblique and is not very easily characterizable. This looks like a face rather than a brain, like a monkey face. I don't know, but yeah. But yeah, the point of this quality assurance plot, the realignment one, is just to make sure that there is no gross subject motion that is residual after the realignment step, after all of the motion has been corrected for all of the gross motion at least.
Okay, so that sounds good. So then, I think I mentioned in an email to you that histogram plots.
Oh yes, I fixed that. Sorry, that was a bug actually. I fixed that. You should be able to look at those fine now.
Oh, perfect. Okay, that's awesome.
Should these be the same as in the volume-based analyses?
Yes, those are the same. The measures that we are looking at here is the number of valid scans. So basically the ART, how many residual time points do you have after the ones that are identified as outliers remain. Those are the number of valid scans. Invalid scans is kind of like the opposite of that. And then the average motion and average global signal change. So all of these are basically ART measures generated during the outlier identification step, which is both part of the volume-based pipeline as well as the surface-based pipeline.
So then some of the plots I think don't make sense for the surface-based pipeline. So because we're not normalizing.
Right, exactly. The normalization plots, they are in this pipeline, we are going to look all wrong. And this is just showing you that this data is actually not normalized in M&I space, which is fine because it's not. We know that it shouldn't. So you can just totally disregard those plots in this pipeline.
One thing, I actually just sort of looking through these, the structural data plot has the free surfer.
Right. So the structural data, when the free surfer data has been extracted, these plots are going to show you now this like free surfer generated borders, and that appears both in the structural plot and in the surface plot. But even though in the functional plot, even though the actual surfaces have been generated by free surfer and have been generated only from the structural data, but they are showing you those borders in both plots. And those are if you click on details, that's perhaps a little bit simpler because this plot has a lot of information. So just click on details and select a single slice. And check the multi-slice display. Yeah. Okay, so the blue and red lines in here are the ones that are generated by free surfer, and the yellow line in here is the M&I reference borders. In this case, they are totally off the M&I borders, but that's fine because this brain is not in M&I space and it shouldn't be, so that we don't care about that. But the blue and red lines are the gray matter and white matter surface determined by free surfer, and the gray matter and PL surfaces generated by free surfer as well. So those should look a very good fit to the structural data because those are derived from the actual structural data.
So are we then ready to move on to the next one?
I think so, yeah.
So then the registration.
Right, and that is kind of like the most important, this plot is kind of like the most important one for the surface pipeline because this is trying to show you the correlation between the structural and functional data, and it's doing so by showing you the functional data and showing you those free surfer generated lines that we saw before that are a very good fit to the structural data. So if those also fit the functional data, then we know that we have a good correlation, and to the degree that they don't, or the places where that doesn't actually happen, we know that the correlation is not doing a good job, or we have residual deformation or signal dropout or things like that. So in this case, it's not particularly good, at least in the more the most anterior part of the brain. No, sorry, the most posterior part of the brain, right? The ones that are in the, I don't see the actual numbers, but it should be y equals some negative number probably at the very top left.
Right.
So for these first, subject 1 and 2 here are the scans.
Right, so subject 1 and 2 are the ones that, yes, perhaps we weren't totally sure whether the deformation that we were going to get from this is going to be good quality, and the correlation in these places looks fine, right? You can actually, you can click or check and uncheck the view overlay button to kind of like to make those blue and red lines disappear, so you can actually look at the functional data like borders, and then you click again on the view overlay to look at the structural, and you see whether there is a good match between those two things or not. Sorry, go ahead.
For these two, there's clearly a shift. So
Yeah.
there's definitely a shift more where the structural is more interior than the functional. And there may be some other more subtle shifts, but when we were looking at this, it raised the question of whether, so in this I think there's just a shift, something's going on. But then if we look at subjects 3 through whatever, some of them, there are a couple of things. One, it seems like on some of them, the alignment's it's okay, but maybe not fantastic. Some of them it seemed like it was pretty good. But in those, when you look at the functional data, it actually doesn't look like what I would expect an unwarped functional volume to look like. And I was thinking after we talked that maybe it's because more recently I've been looking at the DTI data, where you do see a pretty big change in what the data look like in those problem areas. But I think that for these two, we need to look more into how to deal with just having the phase.
Yeah.
Right. We just have the phase encoded warp field. For the other ones,
so could you show the subject 3 just so that we can, or some other subject that is not 1 or 2, just to kind of like take a look at how those roughly look? Because I know subject 1 is perhaps it's just something else. I mean, because we didn't have the entire.
Alfonso, what do we need to do to save the annotations when we make them?
I think they are saved automatically, right? They are not when you just.
4 as well, but we made some yesterday and they're not here.
Very insightful annotations.
Oh, I don't know. I'll double. Oh, perhaps I created a new report because I was when I fixed the histogram, the violin plots. I recreated I repeated the QA report create basically step on this data. So that might have created a new QA report on you and have the data. Yeah, I probably should delete that. Or I should have done it in a different directory so that it doesn't. It's probably that we are actually looking at a new set of plots that were generated yesterday when I was fixing these violin plots rather than the ones that you were working on before.
I think it's not a big deal.
I'll see if I can just copy it or make sure that when we generate a new plot, a new report, the comments survive that.
Yeah.
I'll take a look at that.
So this is S303.
Okay. Okay, so could you, Jason, if you don't mind, show what you were saying basically here? Yeah, right. I see those anterior parts that they don't, like huge signal dropout, right? And this is supposed to be after the fill map correction. So yeah.
So this is the mouse. So the first thing I notice is that this is, so if I take this off, right? This
right.
is. What I'm seeing here, if I go up and down, let's see here.
What is this?
This is just the functional data.
Oh.
And I'm still seeing a lot of warping here, right?
Right.
And so what I was wondering is, are we actually looking at the unwarped functional?
Yes, definitely. Go check on. You can actually check that if you go to effects and go to the bottom option, the one that says info, it tells you which things are being shown in there. So the one that says info at the bottom of that same thing that you are showing.
Yeah. Man, that is.
Sorry, on the same slice display window, if you click on effects as you were just doing, the one on the bottom it says info, yeah, right there, and it tells you which files are showing you. So it's taking the background image is the functional data that has been shown, and it's the U sub something. So U is the realignment step that actually does the unwarping as well. So that should be unwarped, and then the other data that is being shown is the T1 weighted, that's just the structural data that is showing you the outlines for. So yeah, this data should be unwarped, or at least it has gone through the realignment step with unwarping. So if that didn't give you an error, then the data has been unwarped. And you can actually check the history as well if you are curious and you want to see whether that gives you some error message or something like that. If you right click on that window on the conlog history, thing. And select the reload log history. Yeah, that one. It tells you all of the things that happen to this data. So you can actually look at what the realignment, whether it was actually run on that or not. And I cannot see too much in this screen, but it should tell you something in there that tells you that the different preprocessing steps that have been run on this data. And if you see any warning or any weird messages there, it will tell you that something went wrong, right?
So yesterday, when we looked at this, I thought that we had checked, I thought that we had looked for what we thought was the, or no, what we did is we looked at the slices, the functional data from a previous volume-based iteration. So if you look at the volume-based stuff, it's the same thing. But we loaded this up, we did the QA report, and we looked at the slices for the same subject and the same slice, and they looked, to my eye, identical. So
I see. So that could be a problem with the field map generation then. One way to check that quickly would be to show, I probably should generate this as an additional plot, but if you go to the directory where the preprocessed data is for this subject, so that would be in the derivatives folder, and then something called sub straight 03 for this subject, and then func for functional data.
So do you want me to go there?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll show you just quickly. If you go to that, if you go from MATLAB, it's going to be simpler to then display stuff in there. Yeah, so CD to derivatives, then sub srate 03, I think is the one that we were looking at. Oh no, sorry, derivatives. Then that's the name of the derivative. It should be something like surface underscore field maps. Yeah. And then the subject folder, so that would be sub srate 03, for example. And then inside here, the functional folder, the FUNC. Okay, and in here you should have something that is called, I think, ref something and something that is called uref something, which are the actual images that are used during the creation of the voxel displacement map. The SPM uses a functional image as reference for the corregistration of the field map to the functional data, and then it actually applies the field map correction to that image so that you can easily check how it looked before the correction and how it looked after the correction. So those are, so you can do, for example, let me see. I cannot see very well it's a little blurred, but so it tells something, it should be called ref underscore sub srate 03 something. And then another file that is called uref with the same thing.
Right, yeah, I can see those.
Okay, so if you can then just type SPM underscore check underscore registration. Yeah, and then the names of those two files.
With just a space between them?
Yes, with a space between them, exactly, yes. And that will show you basically side by side these two images, the before and after warping, and allow us to kind of look at to what extent the correction did something, or it did something wrong, or it did something in the opposite direction. Because sometimes, I mean, this one field that I didn't talk about the other day, the blip directionality thing, which is a little bit of a mess, how that is defined. So it's entirely possible that we are applying the correction in the opposite direction than what we would want to actually apply the correction to. And SPM, at the end of the day, basically tells you, well, try both directions and see which one works better. If you cannot tell it from the data itself, and telling it from the data itself is kind of complicated because there are a couple of different conventions. And SPM changed over time what they call positive and negative direction of the blip directionality of the phase encode direction, so that makes it even more complicated. So anyway, let me see what is.
It should be. Is it all lowercase?
No, it's called SPM. Let me see. SPM check. Perhaps I'm telling you the wrong name. Perhaps it's registration instead of, yeah, it's registration instead of co-registration. Sorry about that. Okay. So which one did you write before the ref is? Okay. So on the top should be the before before correction, and the bottom should be after the correction. So if the direction, let me see, that doesn't look that well. It's gonna, no, it doesn't look thoroughly good to me. That correction, in fact, it seems to be
Looks
doing the
terribly
opposite.
similar.
Yeah. That I don't like. Could you also just at the same line, in the same line, just to show another image, also show the fill map, just to make sure that we have it in the proper space. So do the same thing and then add the one that is called VDM, yeah, for the same subject one. Yeah, and perhaps I should, it might not be a bad idea to actually, this type of co-registration plots, make them like the default part of the pipeline plots. Just co-registration of the ref, uref. Okay.
The bottom image of
Notice it's inverted from what I would expect it to be. What I expected. I guess I don't know what those are. I don't know exactly what those should look like.
Right. I don't have that much experience with this as well. So but to me, it doesn't look that convincing that this is doing the proper thing, because I mean, a lot of the things that are wrong on the data are signal dropouts, and this is not supposed to. This cannot do anything about signal dropouts. It's just do something about signal distortions, the spatial distortions, but I don't know. To my eye, that distortion correction doesn't seem to be applying. The space seems to be the same, but the correction doesn't seem to be applied. Could you just move around in the more inferior portion of like inferior temporal lobes, kind of like to see the places where there is like a huge yeah.
So I guess this looks dark where you would expect the most warping.
Yeah.
And bright where you
might. I also cannot tell by I mean, in some places it does look better, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure about this. Whether perhaps it might be worth trying the opposite directionality and seeing whether that gives us something better, because it is entirely possible that we are, and that would be, remember when we enter the blip, it's called VDM_blip field in the config files when the preprocessing pipeline, I think we enter the VDM, like the time, the echo time parameters, and we also, I don't know if we leave it by default or we actually enter the directionality in there. Could I look at one of your configuration files, if you don't mind?
There is a -11 in there.
So yes, at the bottom of this file, yeah, it says VDM blip -1. Okay, so I mean, that is what I would expect as well to be the default, but I don't know. You could just change it to +1 or just 1, that, and try again, perhaps on, well, yes, and we will recreate either on a different pipeline just so that we can compare them, or overwrite the results on the same pipeline and just, but make sure to create first a report so that then we can compare the two pipelines.
I can rename it just so I think it's not easy.
Because it might be worth seeing the directionality. And the parameters, the echo time parameters are fine, right? Those we got it from the DICOMs, and we're pretty certain that those are.
Yeah, and I checked them for every subject. So it's just S-rate 1 and 2 that we weren't sure about the short echo time, but it was consistent for everyone else.
Okay, so yeah, if you don't mind, I mean, this is a little bit of trial and error, but if you don't mind just changing the blip directionality and seeing whether the images that we get are better or clearly worse, that will give us a little more confidence or less that we are doing it right or wrong.
just looking at some example running through this. I think using the Read Echo maps, and it does change after our program. It changes, but not a lot.
Yeah, I mean, there is a big portion of the problem in some of these areas, like the most frontal pole type of areas and inferior temporal, like also anterior, are a lot of signal dropout, and that basically cannot be done anything about it, basically, other than changing the phase encode direction or to try to produce those effects in different places. But there's some level of distortion correction, that at least a spatial distortion, that like the brain doesn't quite look like it's I don't know, or like the warping of the spatial warping on these like regions that appear to be pretty much close to where the signal dropout happens. Those should be apparent from the, or at least from the few examples that I've seen, those should be apparent from the images, or the before and after correction. But I don't know to what degree these. I don't know. I haven't had enough experience to be confident that from these images to tell you whether those are wrong, clearly wrong, or those are within the acceptable range or not.
What's puzzling and was why I was sort of wondering about whether or not we're looking at the right image, was that when you look at the overlay, it actually seems worse for at least a few, if not several, of the subjects when you add the field map.
That was for volume based.
For volume based, it seemed worse than what it was previously, and then that sort of bore out. Actually, suggesting it wasn't just a long image, and that the
right. So if that is the case, that could be I mean, yeah. With these field maps, they always tell you to basically look at the data and figure out whether the data actually looks better or worse, and if it's actually looking worse, then try the opposite directionality, because that might be the typical case. And the problem with the directionality thing is that it's very confusing. There is one actually DICOM information field that is actually extracted by DCM to NICs, which is converted into this phase encoding direction property of the JSON file that this generates. But this is telling you the encoding direction in some format that it's going to be something like J plus or J minus, and then that doesn't, at least as far as I can tell, directly translates into an SPM convention. I think J minus is probably like a negative directionality of what SPM used for the blip directionality, and J plus is positive, but I'm not 100% certain that is the case, and I couldn't find actual information telling you that with any confidence. So I don't know. If any of you have run into this information in some cases, that I would be very happy to hear about it, because I've been trying to dig up that information myself and I couldn't. So currently I'm using this convention. Basically, if phase encoding direction is J minus, I'm just transforming that basically to make blip directionality, which is in SPM convention, this is called K space traversal blip directionality field, which can be positive or negative. So I'm taking J minus to be negative and J plus to be positive, but I would definitely like a little bit more confidence about that. Okay, so this is the step where the EP creation is going on, and this is just going to change the directionality of all of the deformations, because this basically now deformations in the positive direction are going to go in the negative direction and so forth with this change.
I remember talking with Matthias about this J plus minus, and I thought he had some source, or at least he had figured something. I don't know.
Right. Maybe something. I don't remember. I remember looking at, because at some point we looked into DICOM header reader to find a particular a number, but I don't know for sure this, but we can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I read somewhere that the J minus translates into what is called Y minus in FSL convention. So I should probably be able to figure out whether the X plus minus XYZ plus minus convention, how that translates into the SPM convention. So the FSL to SPM perhaps is a little bit more, there is more documentation on that. So I don't know, there is still hope that we might be able to figure that out. And I think we have that information for these files. in the dicoms, the J plus or J minus like information. It's only that we are not 100% certain whether that means a positive number in terms of SPM conventions or not. In any way, trying it out also is never hurts. We should see a difference in the results, and one of them should be clearly better than the other. Okay, so perhaps we should have tried just running one single subject. So instead of running all of them, I just run. But why is, oh, because it's creating one for each. Right, it's creating one for each run because the whole formation thing needs session specific files. So,
yeah, so I think I just ran S803.
Ah, right. Okay. So since I saw many of them, I assumed that that they were going for all subjects, but you're right. It was probably just going through the different sessions. And yeah, and it has already, let me see what it's actually doing now. It's doing the co-registration of the functional to structural. Okay, so it's close to finishing. Yeah, I mean, we would like to have, remember, Jason, that we had at some point thought of a measure to kind of like estimate to what degree the functional to structural co-registration was good or not, like in terms of a single number, right? We were looking at.
We discussed using
like the contrast.
So the measure of how uniform the values were within.
Right, exactly.
Or across versus within the,
right.
If you took the white matter surface, looking at that was what it was. So, and I was thinking of that as we started here. If we had something like that, because when you look at the overlap, the registration of the subjects that were worse, you can see that it seems like the white matter surface derived from the structurals were shifted in most cases anteriorly relative to the functionals. Right. And so my understanding of what happens here when you typically is that the warping is really in how the signal is mapped spatially into the volume or on a slice. So what you get at the anterior portions of the brain is a mapping of the signal from voxels that are within the brain to a position that's more posterior, right? So it just sort of squishes the front. It looks like it's squishing the front of the brain in.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so if you were to unwarp that, in how I think in an ideal scenario,
it should be kind of like stretching it out.
That would really match, like for every one that we saw, I think it would match the structurals better if that was done.
Okay, so this has finished. So you can recreate the plots then and see whether that improves them. Let's see. There are a number of plots that are giving you an error message in there, but that's fine. That's just because it doesn't have any like gray matter regions that result from the segmentation step, because we didn't actually run segmentation. So that's fine for this pipeline. Okay, there. Yes, right. If you can just go to the next. All right, we only have one subject now in this pipeline because we only processed this one, so this is fine. Okay, so if you can go to the one that says like a correlation between the, yeah, exactly, that one. Let's try to see if that looks better or not.
Maybe. Can you load up the other one too? There's still a
Right, you still should have it in there in the some other window.
Yeah, I have to have another terminal, right? Or can
I
You can plug it in there as well. Just call the FL basic QA plots for the other pipeline, right? And then, yeah, and then look at that same subject now. You don't have all subjects. So. Right.
need to just be exactly the same. Because the front orbit is not real.
Yeah, that is one possibility as well. Okay.
It's not the same.
Yeah.
So I don't know which one is which, but
The bottom is the new one, right?
right.
Or am I wrong?
Well, perhaps it's good that we don't know which one is which. Let's try to figure out which one we think is better, and then we'll figure out which one is which.
Yeah. Good job. All right.
But when the one goes on the right here, that'll be the newest one.
No, remember you pulled up the old one
The
second.
right.
So
Yeah, you can tell from the FX info, but what I was saying is that perhaps we should do it blind and try to figure out which one we would call better without knowing which one is which. Might be a good practice.
the bottom.
I'd call the bottom one better.
I think so as well, but could you change different slices just to see other evidence?
Go to something like there-ish. Yeah, and then match that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bottom.
Yeah. So the bottom looks better to me as well.
Yeah. So one of the key places you can tell is if you see the ventricles, the white ventricles, the more interior ones up above, right there. So underneath, so if you just go up from there, you can see that on the top one, you see the lighter voxels for the functional data is posterior to where the line is, like where the blue white matter surface is, where it's a much better match on the bottom. Or it's a better match on the bottom.
Right. Yep, I see.
There's still, yeah. And this sort of fits with, I was just looking up this tutorial that is provided by, I think it's Martinos at MIT, that I passed around that shows how to use the SPM tool to do this using the gradient echo field maps that we get at MGH. And when you show the warp and unwarp side by side, this is about the level of difference that I saw. It's just one slice, one example, so it might be better for some scans, but this does look a little bit better. But should we confirm that the bottom is actually the
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so yeah, go to the bottom and click on effects and that should tell you basically the name. Yeah, version 2. Okay, so we are happy.
So it's that.
Okay, so this is one vote for, I think, the opposite. Do you mind checking one thing for me? This is only for my sake, but could you, if you are already in the functional folder in MATLAB, could you look at there should be a few JSON files in there, not many of them. Sorry, in the folder that we went before, it was the derivatives. It doesn't matter which one because we are going to look at just the JSON files, and then in whichever subject, or well, this subject, since we are working on this sub of 3, and then func folder for the functional data, and then looking at the JSON files, look at the JSON file of the raw functional data. You should have like 4 JSON files in there, probably for the 4 ones. So see where are they?
Yes, here.
Right, excellent. So just look at one of those JSON files. I'm trying to look at whether there's going to be one information field map that is field that is called something like face encoding direction. I want to look at whether it says J plus or J minus. So just edit. Yeah, just edit it. No, it doesn't have anything. Too bad. Perhaps in the field map of the actual field map acquisition, instead of the functional acquisition, we'll have more information. Yeah, good point. So CD to before, yeah, to instead we are within the func folder. So instead of that, go to a folder that is called fmap. So CD fmap, and then in here do the same thing. Edit the JSON file for whichever, however it's called in there.
So the sub, same.
It's probably the yes, only that it has an underscore fmap instead of underscore bold. It's called underscore fmap. Yeah, that thing. Okay. Well, wow, it's too blurry. But can you tell whether there is something that is called face encoding direction or something like that in there?
Yes. So it's J minus.
J minus, and it's a plus. Okay, so this is one vote for the opposite thing than what I was thinking. So J minus should be positive in terms of SPM directionality instead of negative, if this is consistent, right? I mean, if we got it right, and this directionality is actually doing a better job than the other one. So yeah, I would say try the same thing on every subject, basically just running every subject through this new pipeline version 2. And if this replicates that the data is looking like across subjects better, then we have a more confident result, and the directionality was basically the opposite of what we thought it was. I'll try in the meantime to figure out, and if you guys want to try to do that, this is a kind of try to look in the web or in the information resources what you can find about the relationship between this J plus and J minus directionality of the face encoding direction. Basically, this is telling you whether it's anterior to posterior or posterior to anterior, but the way that this is acquired. But well, the relationship between that information and what is called the K-space traversal directional blips directionality or blip directionality in SPM lingo, which I think they call it the direction of how in K-space, the direction in which K-space is transversing the face encoding direction. But they have their own convention of how to call that. They call this X, Y, C directions for the 3 directions of the data that have been acquired. So X should be the frequency direction, encoding direction, Y should be face encoding direction, and C should be the slice selection direction. Well, they have their whole thing. So if you can figure out, I'll try to do this myself as well, but if you can try to figure out the relationship between these J plus, J minus X, this would be something like IJC, or the 3 directions in the DICOM lingo, and then plus minus tells you the directionality, the direction of this thing. And then in SPM convention, it's just a plus or minus 1 because the SPM always assumes that the second direction is the face encoding direction. So the relationship between those parameters, the DICOM parameters and the SPM parameters, would be what we are trying to look for to basically gain a little bit more confidence that this J minus information that we have for these subjects actually corresponds to the positive blip directionality in SPM convention.
It sounds like I've just found some thread that actually Chris Warden contributed to. He's the MRI cron row guy.
Yep.
And it sounds like the IJ, the J for, and J minus, that's part of the puzzle. But then there are other variables.
Ah.
Now it says something like, now you need to determine the polarity of the phase encoding. So there's basically the dimensionality, polarity, but then also depending on what converter you use, it may store data in rows that go from top to bottom, but sometimes it's not the case. So it sounds like the advice to just give it a try both ways.
Yeah, I mean that's the like. Whenever I look for this information, I end up being confident that we should just try both and figure out which one is on the data.
Ultimately, we need to do this for
for data that is pretty old. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
What we could, I mean, what's nice is that we could tell.
Yeah, right. I mean, if we can, yeah, I mean, it would be even nicer if we had like a single number that we could just look at whether it improves or it gets worse, and it will be consistent. But at least being able to do that visually is at least gives us some confidence that we are on the right track, basically.
The other thing is that we could go back, is if you look at that tutorial, which unfortunately I use the same one, but if you look at that tutorial, what is it? It's through MIT.
I can bring it up here too.
That one, it may be that we can pull stuff from there. Looks like it may not have everything we need. Yeah, that's that one. But it looks like it probably doesn't have everything we need. What I was hoping is that we could look at that box and then just be able to determine what we would want to do. If you go down, if you scroll down, there's a box there. Yeah, but I don't think it has everything that we need. But yeah, maybe PM versus RI.
Yeah, I mean, this has a subset of all of the information that is in the DICOM, so it might be that digging a little bit deeper into the DICOMs will allow us to more confidently determine what we need to know, basically, here.
And all of this data has now been unpacked with the DICOM to Nix tool. So
I think so. Oh, it hasn't. Oh, okay. So perhaps the latest version has some additional information when that is extracted when encoding. Okay, it's definitely worth a try as well. Yep.
That thread I can send you.
Yeah.
Oh. I would say even before you look into a single other thing, just rerun these.
Yeah.
And we'll look again and see if it looks better, because if the field maps, the alignment should be better. If it's worse, something's not right. It could be studies, right? Maybe
yeah, and
maybe they're not great, but for these subjects, it's all adults. I would have thought that they'd be.
yeah, and for the first two subjects, perhaps, I mean, we should, at least for these considerations, just keep them separately, basically, because I mean, if let's try to improve or make sure that the results are as good as possible on the rest of the subjects, and then we'll look at the first two subjects and figure out where the correction for those subjects and the deformation correction for those subjects is as good as for the other subjects or not, and try to determine what to do with those later on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, and we also didn't go through other quality assurance plots. Basically, there is the main one is the surface-based plot that tells you the first contrast. That should be something like a speech minus baseline contrast, most likely, that for every subject. So if everything worked relatively correctly, you should see there like a speech-related activation, like assuming that the first contrast was a speech minus baseline. I didn't look at the configuration files for this.
it's interesting. Those look pretty good, except for those first two subjects, and one in particular where the activity is shifted back.
Right, and a lot of what is happening with this unwarping has to do with what's happening in the more anterior sections of the brain. I mean, the correlation I think is pretty good between functional and structural in the kind of like middle sections of the brain, like speech-related areas. Probably it's not that affected by what we are doing right now, but this affects basically how good or bad the data is going to be in other areas that we are also perhaps interested, but they are not as obvious in the main speech minus baseline contrast, right? Yeah, because if the whole anterior portion of the brain is wrongly co-registered, it won't be as apparent in these plots anyway, because those are basically showing like a central sulcus type of activation.
If you look at, if you just scroll and see 3 and go through a few of the ones that are pretty good but have a little bit of trouble, and then you look at 2, you can clearly see a difference in where it maps speech motor activation. One's still also shifted back a little bit, but not to the same degree. So,
all right.
I'll be rerunning these.
Cool. Yes, and we'll get all of these plots on you as well. And then there is also the plots for the quality of the design, basically the first level design. I didn't look at this, but have you looked at whether there were any issues in there? Basically, they will tell you this looks fine, and then there's another one that is called something about contrasts, SPM contrast, yeah, that one, and that will flag whether there are any issues in the contrast estimation, whether there is some particular contrast that cannot be estimated from the data or something like that. So let's see. In these cases, contrast, effect estimability is fine. It doesn't happen for individual effects. That's probably because they are collinear, but the contrast estimability should be high for all of them. And the contrast orthogonality should be relatively low, at least lower than 50% for most of the contrast. So that looks relatively fine. I cannot tell from this plot because it's very blurry, but what are the names of the last 3 contrast names? So basically in the bottom right plot, the ones showing contrast estimability, which ones are the ones that have lower contrast estimability?
I'm also having a hard time seeing it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
This plot is always, for some reason it's in a lower.
It's low resolution. Oh, okay. Oh, well, this is just because it's showing in a MATLAB window, right? You can just zoom on that. So basically yes. I don't know which version. Yeah, if you just zoom in, you should be able to see it in high resolution. Perhaps. Yeah.
But
so this is stress minus normal, clear minus normal, and fast minus normal.
Oh, okay. So the last 3 are the ones that are comparing different conditions, and the first contrast are the ones that are comparing something to baseline.
Well, that's right. The movement time is.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, that's expected as well. That is
That's not overall though. If that like a value that's below 1 there, that's probably not great.
Right. I mean, this is telling. Let me see if I recall. This is telling you the t-value that you would expect to see if the signal-to-noise ratio was 1. So basically, if the size of the fluctuations that you expect to see in the Ball signal are of the same order as the size of the residual fluctuations in the Ball signal are accounted for by your model, that's a signal-to-noise ratio of 1, then you would get a t-value of approximately 1 for those contrasts, basically. So it's telling you for a given size of the effects that you are looking at, what is the expected power or sensitivity of your data. So yeah, 1 is kind of like a borderline. Then you are only going to be able to see something if it basically sticks out from the noise. Basically, these subtle effects might not be as visible. And the fact that it's much higher for the contrast, the stress minus baseline as compared to the conditions might have something to do with our design. There might be better ways to design our data so that it doesn't have so high contrast for the things that we don't need as much contrast, which are the basic individual conditions versus baseline, which we typically just use for reference just to make sure that we are looking at the proper areas of the brain. And then the contrast that we do care about typically in the experiments are the ones that are comparing the different conditions. So I mean, you can design the experiment better, try to improve the ones on the right and decrease the ones on the left, basically.
So this has been the issue with this all along, is that we just don't see anything when we do these within speech condition contrasts. And in this case, we're including the duration as a covariant, so
I mean, I will have to look at why that is happening. I mean, the most likely reason is because those are perhaps like too far apart from each other. So you should have gone through shorter blocks. For example, if you have like very long blocks where you have individual conditions, and then you are trying to compare one very long block of one condition versus another long block of one individual condition that happened 2 minutes later, then you're not going to have much power to do that comparison. So you should be better off just running shorter blocks. But I don't know if that applies to this data. Just saying one particular example.
This was I think it was sparse sample, so it was
this was sparse sampling.
And they were randomly.
They were all randomly selected. So
yeah, I don't know if there was any sort of restriction on, you couldn't have a repeat or there was like a distance between them, but.
Right, and do you have many much more baseline conditions or something like that? That could also be.
So was it 50? It wasn't 50-50, right? It was.
No, I think it was like
basically
an equal amount of like baseline clear.
Right. And so the movement time. So I guess I don't really know enough about this to know how this is just related to like how we're moving effects, because you can imagine this duration is going to be highly correlated with the speech, no matter what. And so we're getting rid of the effect of speech to a large degree, that you're going to be removing the ability to determine any difference between those conditions. But I don't know if that plays a role here.
Let me see the orthogonality. It doesn't. Yeah, again, I cannot see the little fonts in here, but it might be. Could you just highlight the effect estimability? Just make it bigger so that I can see the effect names that are showing there. So I want to look at the x level of that plot. Yeah, the effect estimability plot. Yeah, x. So let me see. No, nothing clear. There you go. Let's see. So we're looking at the normal times MT. So we're looking at the covariation. So this is, you have MT was reaction time, or what was it in this experiment?
MT is duration.
Yeah.
The duration, right.
Time. And remember, so we did this this is the design where for baseline, so if we just want to look at each contrast versus baseline, we did not add a duration covariate. So we just wanted to see, we didn't care what the duration was, we just wanted to look at the difference between the response and that speech condition versus baseline. But then for these other speech contrasts, we expected that duration alone, so if you're speaking more quickly, or I should say if you're speaking more slowly, so you're saying the same thing but over a longer duration, that you might see more activity just because you're speaking more quickly. So the thinking was, well, maybe we should get rid of the duration effect there.
So or at least just try the same plots without for the same experiment without the direction correction, just to make sure, or at least evaluate to what extent the decrease in sensitivity that we see for the comparison of the conditions that we care about compared to the individual conditions versus baseline is actually related to that or not. Is it related to having less data for that comparison, or is it related to the control actually removing a lot of the variability in that? So we could tell that basically by by just creating a design that doesn't control for that and looking at these same plots, basically the same design analysis plots for that, and looking at the sensitivity of those contrasts in that case. Because this is actually not telling you anything about the data itself, right? This is only looking at the design matrix, and it's figuring that out from the design matrix. If you had some data that had this signal-to-noise ratio, what is the power or sensitivity that you're going to have to detect something on that data? But it's not actually looking at the data. It's all information that has to do with the design, how the design information is encoded, and how the only thing that is kind of like related to the data is all of the some of the parameters in the design matrix, like the motion parameters, are actually obtained from the data. So yeah, if you have some condition that is very correlated with motion or something like that, then you will see that that condition is not very orthogonal in the contrast or effect orthogonality plot, and you will see that the sensitivity for that plot also goes down. But that doesn't seem to happen in here so much.
So can you, this is effect estimability, right? And these first few are the actual speech.
Yeah.
So
could you make them bigger just to see which ones are those? Those are yes, and they are telling us that they are not individually estimable, so they are probably related, right? So stress, normal, fast, clear. So do we have a baseline condition, or baseline is kind of like the average of all of them, or do we have like a separate baseline condition?
There's a specific baseline condition. That's the first one listed here.
So we don't have it individually. Why? Normal T. This, I don't know. Typically, when you cannot individually estimate that, but you can actually estimate the contrast, that typically just means that the individual, there is some redundancy in this data that we cannot tell you. You cannot estimate one of those unique. Oh, yeah, probably it's just the baseline, right? So all of these things are probably related to the you know, how, at the end of the design matrix, how you include a session-specific average. So you are kind of like disregarding anything that is happening on average across all of the time points, across all of the scans, right? So all of these 5 things are dependent to that baseline, basically, or average level. They can be compared to one another, but you cannot tell anything about their actual height because unless you contrast it to that like session-specific average. I don't know if I'm being too clear. So
but in every session, or every run, all of these conditions were in there somewhere. You know, they were randomly.
Right, exactly. There are no additional time points that doesn't have either at least one of those 5 conditions. So if you have then another column in the design matrix that has all ones for all of the time points, then that column and these 5 columns are going to be linearly dependent, and the rank of those 6 columns is going to be actually 5, because there are only 5 things that you can estimate from that data, which is going to be the average signal within each of those individual 5 conditions, but there are not 6 things that you can actually estimate from that data, right? And that's why it's telling you that the individual effect size are not estimable, but the contrast that you are then looking at, they are estimable, because you're always going to be comparing one versus stress minus baseline or normal minus baseline. So those contrasts are the ones that are shown in the right plot. Those are estimable, even though the individual effects are not uniquely estimable, because they could just happen. You could just add 2 to the numbers that you get for the beta values so basically each one of these in the X label, each one of these image things corresponds to a beta image, right? So the SN0 baseline corresponds to a beta image, which is, I don't know, beta 1, for example, and the clear is going to be beta 2, and so on. And then you're going to have also a beta that corresponds to the session average. So what this is telling you of not being estimable is that if you change the betas for, I don't know, for the beta 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, for those 5, if you just add them 5 to all of those numbers, or add 10 to any numbers that you get in the beta images, and then you decrease by 10 the beta images corresponding to the session average, you're going to get exactly the same fit. So the actual numbers that you get from these beta images are not uniquely defined. They have some redundancies in it. So this is basically, I don't know, perhaps I'm just repeating something that is already clear. It makes sense.
So what then, when we see the parentheses 1, is this like, so now we're looking at the normal by movement time. So There's this.
Right. So the parentheses are the session numbers, and the ones that we see in the effects are anything that is in the design matrix. So every column in the design matrix corresponds to one effect, or at least in this lingo, right? And those are the names that you're seeing in this SN1 normal times MT to the one first power. That corresponds to that one particular column of the design matrix that actually looking at the interaction between the response time or reaction time within the normal condition for the first session, and it's modeling that interaction basically.
What's session 0?
Session 0 is the one that is done when it doesn't typically exist in a typical SPM design, but that's created by our scripts. When you use that option, remember that we have an option in our FrankLab scripts to have either session specific or session invariant estimation of effects, and we are choosing the session invariant one. That is basically what it does with the session 0. It takes what typically would have been a stress for session 1, a stress for session 2, a stress for session 3, like different beta values, and it collapses them into one single column of the design matrix that I call them SN0 to correspond to basically all sessions, as opposed to the session specific stuff.
Are you estimating each condition separately for each run?
No, that's not happening here because you have those SN0s. If you don't see those SN0s and instead of you see something like SN1 baseline, SN2 baseline, SN3 baseline, then you have session-specific conditions. If in this case you have SN0 baseline and you don't see the baseline effect anymore, you see the interactions, right? But you don't see the baseline effects. And that's because we are modeling session-invariant effects.
So why are there different columns for different sessions? Like, why is there a session 1 normal by MT and a session 2 normal by MT?
Right, because those are the interaction effects. I don't know if I have an option to allow you to specify whether you want those interactions to also be session specific or not. But by default, it's only but you can actually specify which contrast do you want to be by default. And I think by default, when you specify the session invariant effect, I think by default it's going to use anything that you mention in your contrast definitions. Those are going to be the sessions that are modeled as session invariant. If you want to add other effects as well, like the interaction effects as well, to be session invariant, you just list them as the additional contrast that additional effects that you also want to model, have our scripts to model a session invariant. Otherwise, by default, it's only going to use or model a session invariant the ones that you actually mention in your contrast specification files.
I think it would make sense to do that then here for the interaction, right?
It would make sense to, sorry, what?
To make all of these effects session invariant, not just the,
Okay, you mean by, I mean, the problem is that by default, we don't want all of them to be session invariant because many of these are going to be like motion, like a correlation with motion, right? And that you want to be session specific, and others are going to be session effects. And those you also typically want to be session specific. So the scripts cannot make the assumption that everything, when you say session invariant, then you want all of the things to be session invariant. So you have to either guess it or you can have to provide it manually, which effects you actually want to model a session invariant. By default, if you don't specify it manually, then it's going to use this assumption that anything that you're going to look at in terms of your contrast are the things that you care about, and those are the things that are going to be session invariant, and everything else. But that's just a guess. I mean, it's doing like a best possible scenario guess in the lack of information. But the best thing would be for you to provide actually which things you actually want to be session invariant explicitly as a list. Makes sense?
It's somewhat unclear what. So the MT is the covariate that your duration. So you're trying to eliminate the effect of duration across each of these conditions. So why? So if they're just covariates, why couldn't they be session invariant?
Well, the invariance across sessions is, well, it's two-sided. I mean, so invariance about session has to do with for this case, for a covariate, for example, for an interaction, it's basically telling you whether the association between functional activation and what was it? This again? This was not response time. This was duration, like a production duration.
Yeah, like speaking time.
Like speaking time. Okay. So the relationship between, so the assumption is that activation is going to change with the speaking time. So longer durations are going to produce more activation than shorter durations. So there's going to be an association between duration length and ball signal activation. And the invariance or not across sessions means that the regression line, the slope of that association, whether it's going to be the same across different runs or it's going to be different. So if you and even if you assume that the regression is going to be the same, then the question is whether you want to model them as separate effect and then you just care about the average across them, or do you want to model them as a single effect that has actually that enforce the slope to be the same across all of the multiple runs and estimate the slope from all of the data. For the cases of the contrast that we do care about, for example, like a stress normal fast like activation in individual in individual conditions, we typically use the session invariant thing in order to be able to get away with individual runs being bad. So if we have a run that suddenly moved a lot, then we're going to have a lot of outliers for that run, and that anything in that run is going to be very difficult to evaluate because we don't have enough time points to like degrees of freedom or anything like that to evaluate it. And the typical approach in SPM is that anything that you want to estimate, it estimates it in a session a specific way. And then if you don't care about sessions, just compute the average across all of the sessions. But that typical approach doesn't quite work when you have a lot of like one particular session that is awfully bad and all estimates are very bad, because then all of the estimates that you get for that session are going to get into the average like in an equal weighted manner, and they are going to affect your add a lot of noise. So instead of doing that, we want to basically change the way that SPM does it by forcing the equality of the effects across session into the design matrix, so it doesn't try to estimate session-specific effects. That was the whole rationale of why using session invariant modeling as part of SPM. So the question of whether we want to do the same or not for something like covariation between functional activation and speech duration, I don't think it's totally clear which way to go. And I don't know, I would probably say that that it's probably safer to make it session specific like we are doing here, because if we only care about controlling for those effects, because even if some of those effects are not going to be very estimable because they are going to be trying to estimate it for one run that doesn't have enough data, that is not going to affect our ability to estimate the other effects that we do care about. It's only going to be controlling a little bit more conservatively than what we otherwise would do if we model them as session invariant. But I don't know, if we don't care about those covariations too much, if we just want to use them as an additional control, then I think it's probably best to keep them as session specific. And if we do care about those covariations and we want to look at to be able to actually estimate the level of association between ball signal and duration for one particular condition and compare them across conditions or something like that, then you're probably right that it would be better to then model them as session invariant effects, because that will give us the ability to estimate those modulation interactions basically in a more robust way.
So when you look at this plot, we see for session 3, normal, fast, and clear MT. So my understanding of this is that it's just talking. We have these columns that are the duration for those conditions, right? So,
right.
And so what would result in just this estimate being lower for a given one of those in a given session?
Well, if it happens for most of the effects in one given session, then it's likely because that session has a lot of outliers. That basically decreases the degrees of freedom of everything, and everything is going to be estimated with less data. So every T statistic for that is going to be lower. If it only happens for one but not another one, then it might have to do with correlation with other effects. So it might be that effect is highly correlated or is more collinear with some other effect like motion or something like that. It just happens to be highly correlated or collinear with that effect, and that is going to be different basically for different conditions and for different effects that you're looking at. So in this case, if for session 2, I don't see. Yeah, it's probably the latest, because it's happening a lot for the stress times motion, right? But it's not happening in the clear or in the normal conditions. So it's perhaps the latter. Is perhaps just that the duration within the stress condition for that particular session happens to be correlated with something else, which likely is going to be motion or some of the other things that we are testing at, because everything else is going to be orthogonal. So if you're looking at the stress values within the duration values within the stress condition in one session, anything that is in a different session is going to be orthogonal to this. Anything that is the average effect of a condition is going to be orthogonal to this. So the only thing that is not orthogonal to this is going to be either other things that are happening in the same, well, not other things. There are other conditions for the same session are also going to be orthogonal, at least almost entirely orthogonal, other than, well, this is a sparse acquisition, right? So there is no overlap between conditions. So then, yes, those are exactly orthogonal. So it's probably just motion. That's the only thing that can be correlated with these values that is not almost by design orthogonal to it. So it's probably just telling you that this more correlated with the motion parameters.
All right.
Actually, can you look at the orthogonality measures as well in the top? So in the plot that is above this, you should also look at the orthogonality measures for the same thing. So that, yeah, if that is lower, then yes, that also seems to support the same thing. So if you see that the orthogonality is lower for the same effects that you are seeing, also sensitivity that is lower, then that has to do with the things that you are trying to estimate are not orthogonal to everything else that you are trying to estimate. Problem. Whether if you don't see that and you see low estimability without having low orthogonality, then that's probably because of something like the residual number of degrees of freedom or something like that for individual conditions or individual effects, that you just have few data points to actually estimate the effect that you're trying to estimate.
So for these plots, so it's kind of like estimabilities, you want to be above 1 generally?
Yeah, there is not an absolute threshold, but yes, I mean, 1 is a relatively minimal value that you would expect to see for something like this.
Okay.
Because signal to noise ratio of 1 is relatively low, right? Because the residual both signal effects after you account for everything. I mean, there is still residual noise, which is just anything that is physiological noise that hasn't been accounted for, and there are motion effects and there are many effects. But it shouldn't be, if you are trying to affect something, if your effect size is of the same size of the noise, basically a signal to noise ratio of 1, that is a very low effect size.
Yeah, right, okay.
And if you're seeing a t-value of 1, then you're not going to have a high power to detect that. You're going to have like something like 40% power or something like that. So it's going to be awful power to detect something that has a signal to noise ratio of 1. So that means that you're only going to be able to detect with any confidence things that are much higher in terms of signal to noise ratio. So basically things that have signal to noise ratio much higher than 1. Yeah. And also another thing that I didn't mention is that the ones in the left, you don't care as much in terms of sensitivity, because you typically you don't care about the sensitivity or anything about the individual effects. You care about your contrast, right? Those are the ones that are actually reflective of what you're trying to estimate, the individual contrast. The ones in the left are just more for kind of like debugging. If there are anything weird happening in your contrast and you want to know why that is happening, then you look at individual effects that are related to that particular contrast that you care about and seeing what is happening in those effects. But in practical terms, you care about the sensitivity of the individual contrast that you're trying to estimate, like the ones in the right, basically, and not so much to the ones in the middle.
Okay, so we got running this with the changing the direction of phase encoding for the rest of the subjects, and then this like running it without the duration covariate, which it's kind of a bummer to go back to that, but it would be pretty interesting here because it's a huge difference. You know, it would be nice to look at that just to see.
Yeah.
And maybe if it does change a lot, then you can sit down and have Alfonso kind of prepare something briefly to go through why that's what the difference
Yeah, I mean, after looking at those differences in the design estimability, it might be worth, like, just as a practice thing, to actually try to figure out why that difference is happening between the different estimability of the different effects, and just seeing whether that is telling us anything about the way that we design experiments that we can improve for the next run or not.
Okay.
I had, if there was nothing else from anybody else, I was running the surface-based pipeline through to the second level.
Right, I saw your message. I'm still working on that. I still don't have a good. I'm trying to integrate the whole second level results display basically for the two pipelines into one script. So that's why I think if I have that finished, that will resolve automatically your issues, because that will the volume-based permutation analysis are all very robustly defined, and I think this is just something that is residual for the surface-based permutation analysis, which I haven't looked at in a long time. So. Yeah, I'm working on that. I'll have an answer for you as soon as possible. Supposedly a day or two.
Does that mean that there will be like an FL basic second level syntax, or?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
So with the FL basic command, would there be a second level version? Or
right, I still don't have that. I mean, currently you can just use the con GLM syntax for that, or but at some point I'll end up having that incorporated as an additional FL basic command that runs second level analysis, and you will incorporate the design information into a config file just the same way that we do with everything else, instead of having to create your design matrix across subjects manually with the con GLM result. But for now, that's just going to be like a wrapper across the functionality that we do have already, which is basically only that you need to use the con GLM functionality syntax now instead of, or the con module, sorry, GLM functionality syntax, as opposed to having something simpler through configuration files.
Does it make sense for us to set a meeting for the same time next week? Because then it just sounds like there's going to be a bunch of more things to look at.
And if it's possible to run this, yeah, let's do it. But so we'll meet next Tuesday at 2. Does that work for you, Alfonso?
Yeah, perfect. No problem.
But actually, if you could just run this, it would be I think good to get it again as soon as we can. Just to go through.
Just in the next couple of days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After things become compressed here, starting soon for me, I'll be away the entire week of the Christmas week. I'll be on email.
I'm going to be away
okay.
From the 21st.
Okay. So as much as we can, often as we can get together between now and then, let's do it. I may take this Friday off to do some stuff, but it's not like I can actually still meet.
That sounds good.
Thank you, Alfonso. Thanks a
Sounds
lot.
good to me. No problem. See you guys.
I have a subject scheduled to come to the scanner on next Monday morning, the 17th. They're supposed to get there at 10 a.m. I don't know if
The